Hello, everyone. My name is Andrea Pitts. Pronouns they, them. I am a uh, early 40s mixed Latinx, non-binary transmasc person with brown eyes, brown hair. Um, and I'm wearing a yellow collared shirt, and I'm in my office on Seneca territory at the University at Buffalo. Um, I am really excited to be part of this session today. I am joined by a couple of amazing colleagues here. But before we kick off with some of the uh, really amazing conversation that we're going to have today. I want to first thank Jamie, who'll be running the tech with us today. So thank you, Jamie. I also want to thank uh, the uh, our amazing organizer, Shelley Tremaine, who has been doing this for a number of years now and has been really keeping, I think, an important dialogue in philosophy and philosophy of disability going, sustained. And I find that really exciting. And I have really tried to make an effort to attend every year because I think Shelley's doing extraordinary work, not only with her blog, her many publications, her research, but also creating digital spaces like this for us to be able to connect and to learn from each other, to share resources, and to strategize. And so I think, Shelley, I am tremendously grateful for what you do. In terms of logistical accessibility setup today. So, as you're seeing, as you may be noticing in the chat right now, there is, we do have someone running tech, who's Jamie Morris. Um, we also have live captioning available, so you can turn on live captioning and adjust the size of that in Zoom. The meeting is also being recorded, and that will be available later through some of the YouTube links. If you have any technical issues while the sessions are running, be sure to reach out to Jamie Morris, and you have that information also in the chat. And if you're, feeling the love and feeling excited, and you want to share some things on your socials, we have a hashtag FIDISSOC CH6. And that's hashtag PHIDISSOCCH6. So philosophy, disability, social change 6, which you can use online. Also, we're going to have a kind of roundtable discussion. We won't be formal presentations for this session, but what we will do is have we'll introduce ourselves briefly, um, offer some introductory remarks, share a little bit about what's on our mind with respect to the relationship between philosophy of disability and trans philosophy. And thinking more of this as a workshop space, so sharing more of what's on our minds, some things that have been kind of, or with our organizing or with our fellow community folks, and then we'll kind of dialogue among each other for about, we're thinking maybe 30 minutes total. Then we'll open it up for Q&A. And then we'll keep the dialogue rolling. So we're really excited to hear from you all. Please note that to communicate with us, we'd really prefer the Q&A function, because that's something that I can keep track of as the moderator. And if you'd like to obviously just share your shout outs and things like that in the chat, that is always welcome. I'll try to keep up with the chat as well, although the Q&A function will be the best method to make sure that I can keep track of those in one place. We'd love to answer all the questions that you have and be able to connect directly. So please feel free to use the Q&A function to connect up with us, and to use the chat function if you've got other things to share during the session. So for now, I think that will wrap up some of the logistics, um, and we'll shift over into the content of the session. So this is our session on philosophy of disability and trans philosophy. We initially had, I believe, 5 of us total who were planning to be here. Unfortunately, Tamsin Kimoto, who was scheduled to be here, got called to jury duty, so Tamsin will not be able to join us. And also Jen Eickers, who was planning to be here, was also unable to be here. As well. And so we are obviously, we wish we could be in communication with them for this session. Extraordinary colleagues doing extraordinary work. But we are glad to be here and hope to be able to sustain a lively conversation among the 3 of us as well. So I will start off. As I mentioned, I'm Andrea Pitts. I'm an associate professor of comparative literature and global gender sexuality studies. Although I've been trained and have worked in philosophy for a very long time. Um, I am proud to say that I've done projects in trans philosophy and philosophy of disability with Shelley and Perry, among many others, probably folks who are on this call as well. Um, and I also work in Latinx and Latin American philosophy. That's kind of my orienting site of both existential relations and also political thought and disciplinary thought. So I'm really excited to be here today, and I'll save a little bit of my kind of more substantive comments about um, philosophy of disability and trans philosophy in just a moment. But let me pass things over to Perry Zurn to introduce himself.
Thanks, Andrea, and thank you also to Shelley and the other organizers and the people who make all this possible. I'm really honored and excited to be here. This is my first time at this particular conference. Um, so again, my name is Perry Zurn. I am also early 40s, but with short brown hair and brown eyes. I am white, kind of European American, and I'm wearing a ball cap and a gray sweatshirt, feeling extra cold today. In general, my work, I've done a lot of work in trans philosophy. I try to think more broadly, not just about transness or queerness, but about where our stories come from and who we're listening to and who we're reading and who we're citing and who we're lifting up and where we recover the wisdoms that we need for today. So I think all of my work has been trying to really take to heart where I've been taught to look for wisdom, but and the limitations of those places and how I can shift in kind of my search and in my dedication to lifting up voices in an academic setting, but also well beyond it. So that's a little bit about me.
Great. Thank you, Perry. And now pass things over to C.
Hi, everyone. I'm C. Dalrymple-Fraser. You can just call me C for pronouns they, them, please. I'm assistant professor in the teaching stream at the University of Toronto. I like teaching, and most of what they assign me is medical ethics. I'll come back to that in a moment. So I'm a white Anglo-Indian genderqueer person in there. I'll try to feel young and say my 30s in the abstract. I'm presenting mass today. I've got some round glasses with a chain, mid-length brown hair, and some facial hair. I'm also wearing a hoodie. It's got a little print of hawk-sized cherry blossoms, woodblock art. And so I'm here in Toronto on Dish with One Spoon Welcome Covenant lands, traditionally for the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, and the Haudenosaunee. And in really moving through philosophy with a disability before I started interrogating gender a little more fully, ended up finding myself being pulled into bioethics as a space where those discourses seemed to happen. And it wasn't until a little while later that I fell into philosophy of disability through people like Shelley in particular, and many other people on the agenda and in the list right here as well. and tried to stray away actually from interrogating a lot of trans stuff because it felt like too much just to live with it, let alone then have to theorize it, while also teaching in a discipline that asks people to critically question whether trans and disabled people do exist and should exist. I think is really the impetus for a lot of my teaching and my research. And so I'm glad for us to have a space. Thank you again to Shelley for constructing that space, for supporting junior disabled and trans scholars in general. And I'm excited to have some conversations, including some that I've seen also in the chat earlier today. I imagine that we're going to have a lot collectively to share.
Fantastic. Thank you, C. Yeah, I also just had a chance to peek at the chat and I was like, "Ooh, this was great." At the Q&A, the previous Q&A. Cool. So, all right. So, I'm gonna open things up here a little bit. Our plan is to really, as I mentioned, share a little bit of, a few minutes apiece per person to kind of talk about, some things that have been on our mind with respect to, I'm thinking more broadly, trans and disabled life. Um, I'm not in a philosophy department, as I currently work in my university. And I'm also now, serving in a kind of, organizing and administrative capacity to work across the humanities, but surprisingly very little with philosophers here at my own institution because a lot of what I think the way that I understand it, the discipline of philosophy is situated here in at University of Buffalo is in this. They consider themselves part of the social sciences because they do a lot of what's called experimental philosophy, where they have a hand in collecting some of the empirical research. So I think they've ended up partnering a lot more with our social science colleagues in our college. Um, rather than the other humanities. So I actually find myself in conversation locally much more with historians, literary scholars, linguists, and a number of other and artists. There's a big art and media studies group here that is really outstanding. So I'm in a very lively and I think active research university and actually a very politicized university as well. But less so, I'm finding myself less in dialogue with philosophers locally. And so it's always nice. Like I do find it really lovely to now be touching base with some of my colleagues in philosophy because I'm kind of still navigating multiple worlds and trying to figure out what, at least for myself, what new spaces I'm in terms of my own thinking and organizing, and then also what things I'm actually moving away from, which is in a sense a lot of disciplinary conversations, which I don't do that to any extent as an exile or as a rejection or a fleeing from our discipline. I have a lot of respect for us, the kind of work that we do as philosophers of disability and trans philosophers. And I do think there are some really extraordinary and amazing, important political work being done in philosophy. So I'm not in any sense trying to intentionally shift out of that dialogue. I think some of it is just happening by virtue of who I'm in conversation with locally. Um, so what I will say is that, a lot of my thinking for the entirety of my training and my professional life has been interdisciplinary. I was doing literary work early on autobiography and self-writing with literary scholars and Spanish literature, Latin American Spanish literary studies. Um, I also, like C, have done some work with clinicians and bioethics, but also found myself very much, uh, you know, struggling to stay within that kind of the terms of that conversation, I'll say, and in fact, I find myself really convinced by some of the work done by Shelley about how a discourse within bioethics can really constrain and cause damage as a disciplinary practice. So I'm not actively working with clinicians here, although I do work with a group of uh, disability studies scholars, as I mentioned, historians, social scientists. There's a big oral history project here called Communities of Care. So I do oral history interviews with local community members who are describing their relationships to care and care webs and care networks. And that's been really fun and enlivening. But it's not particularly meant to be within the domain or the discipline of philosophy to any direct degree. Um, and so the thing, if I'm now kind of shifting back to some of the questions about philosophy of disability and trans philosophy, I will say that one of the things that has kind of been on my mind lately, um, and this is by virtue of the kind of, um, it's there's the massive violence that's happening in the United States right now, by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, um, and the kind of various, deputized networks that are being put to arm the state, including, massive cutbacks for, access to, medical resources and support, including lack of, here in New York State, lack um, of of autonomy and choice for people who are in care receiving relations to be able to hire and to negotiate and choose their caregivers. There's a lot of really devastating changes that have been happening both locally and nationally and internationally that I've been keeping an eye on and feeling and trying to process like so many people. So I'm sure there's been a lot of conversations today about some of those very things. Um, if I'm thinking specifically about trans and disabled life together, one of the things that has come up for me recently that I saw as kind of one of these like flashpoint moments or a kind of like a very telling moment was in the kind of early oral arguments for Charles v. Salazar, which is a Supreme Court case coming out of Colorado regarding overturning a conversion therapy ban in Colorado, and what I you know read and what I heard, and there's been people who are writing about it now, um, is that, for example, Justice Samuel Alito references the 1927 um, case Buck v. Bell, um, that was regarding the sterilization of disabled folks. Like Alito invokes this as like kind of a way to draw doubt on medical consensus, and this is, I think, see, I'm really interested in some of your thoughts on this too, because you're also working in medical. I mean, a lot of us are thinking about medicalization and medical discourses, but it was interesting in this case because Alito references this to cast doubt on the medical consensus that conversion therapy is actually detrimental to trans people. And so what Alito's doing is saying, we saw how terrible, this forced sterilization of disabled folks was. And there was medical consensus at the time. So he's saying that this was the right thing to do. Um, and then he invokes that doubt of medical consensus um, to then cast doubt on the uh, the kind of advocacy and medical consensus around the harms caused by conversion therapy. Now, I'm not an expert in conversion therapy discourses, law. I mean, there's a lot of other really amazing. Florence Ashley is one person who comes to mind who works really diligently and carefully on those issues. Um, but one, and I'm not, particularly invested in the state as an apparatus to defend trans and disabled folks, although I know firsthand how important access to housing, medical, um, sustenance resources is. So I don't want to pretend to kind of turn away from all of the amazing and important things that people need to survive. Um, But and like I said, I'm not turning to the Supreme Court either as a form of, as an answer to questions about justice. What I think is telling for me is that there's, a kind of continued legal, at the very least, in public kind of dialogue about this continued antagonism between, or assumed antagonism between trans and disabled life. And that's the thing that I found really disheartening and really disturbing about that oral argument, was that, it took this, you know, uh, you know, the practice of forced sterilization of disabled folks and then weaponized it against trans folks. Um, or like the view of the moral wrong of the sterilization of disabled folks, and then use that to justify, denying resources to trans folks. And the assumption clearly in that case, as is in many people's minds, is that there's some kind of clear, stark division between trans and disabled life, that trans folks are not disabled and disabled folks are not trans, which of course I don't believe, and I think, is really damaging. But we see again and again through legal discourses, like even the Senate hearings before the, confirmation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I think what's really disheartening is to continue to see that kind of antagonism, and also the kind of assumed heteronormativity, that's also built into that, because I think that was another piece of this, is about this kind of eugenics era reproductive discourse um, about who's deserving or not of having fulfilling sexual life, regardless of its, relationships to reproduction. So I think that's something else that I found really disturbing in that invocation, was this kind of, assumption that, again, the state needs to have some kind of direct role uh, in its, at least in Alito's words, in terms of trying to protect, reproductive capacity, um, rather than thinking about sexual agency and sexual autonomy and sexual life and thriving, which I think would be something entirely different. Not that I would expect that from Alito, but also, again, this is just the kind of compulsory heteronormativity of the state that itself is circulating through these conversations about forced sterilization. So yeah, I want to pause there because, I know there's a lot more to say. And again, I'm sure there are much more brilliant people on this call, than I, about these topics. So I'll just kind of pause and like offer that up as one thing that I've been thinking about, and, also to frame it as a conversation, um, going forward. So yeah, I'll pause there. Thanks. And I'll hand it over to Perry.
Thanks again, Andrea, and I'm really eager to talk about the issue that you've raised. As for me, I want to kind of begin by saying I've more recently finished a book on the term cisgender, the origin of the term, its use value, ways to reimagine it, maybe ways to use it differently now. And yeah, I'm really excited about that particular book, but it opened up a bunch of questions, and one of the chapters, well, a number of things about the book. One thing that it points out is that most of the trans folks who were early on coining and theorizing cisgender as a resistant activity of naming the universal were also disabled or mad people. So there's this really deep overlap. There's this really deep uh, uh, kind of cross community conversation happening, and kind of experiential trans disabled wisdom coming in to like formalize cisgender, that's something that hasn't been pointed out, and I think is important for us to know. But the kind of question about cisgender in general and how it relates to disability was something I really grappled with in a section in a separate chapter in the book. Uh, in part because the way that cisgender has surfaces now and circulates now, it presumes, first of all, that gender is separable from disability and from ability and from all the other kind of formations of embodied life. But also cisgender as a term, again, as it circulates right now, assumes that there is no intersection or affect or kind of interweaving of disabled experience with one's gendered experience when that gendered experience is non-trans. Okay, and there's lots of non-trans forms of gender, and it just sort of presumes that disability does not change one's relationship to gender, um, assuming whether you're trans or not trans. So anyway, it's sort of there's something about cisgender that's resisting the kind of integration of disability and disabled concerns, and so that's a worry I have about cisgender that I raise in the book. Anyway, that kind of project took me down this rabbit hole because cisgender as a term develops in the early 1990s, sorry, 1990s. And I was curious what other terms were being developed at that time. And interestingly, a term like neurotypical was developed around the same year. So in 1993. So instead of 1994, which is when we date cisgender. And trans studies and disability studies, but also trans activism and disability activism, these groups are sort of generating both kind of coterminously here, trying to describe the that which we are not, or the unnamed universal, right? And that project in both cases is kind of a second generation to earlier projects of trying to name whiteness and how does whiteness work, for example, and try to name how patriarchy works and what man is and why man has been a capital M with nothing inside of it. And so I'm interested in these kind of second generation attempts to name universal categories that we start seeing in trans and disability circles and their in overlaps. And so I'm focusing in on the 1990s to try to figure a little bit of that out. So I was really interested to watch what was happening with cisgender, and now going back in to look in disability studies, for example. This is when we get Leonard Davis's attention to normalcy. This is when we get like the really, I think that's in 1995, the real attention to what is normalcy, how did it develop, and we have repercussions of that certainly in for example, Robert Chapman's more recent work. It's also in 1997 we get Rosemary Garland Thompson's theorization of the normate. I mean, of course, she theorized it earlier than that, I think in 1993 in her dissertation, but then it comes out in the book in 1997. So normate, normalcy, ways in disabilities to start talking about that unnamed, undescribed kind of universalizing category. Uh, this is all happening when we're getting cisgender too. It makes sense to start thinking about them together. And I'll tell you a little bit about how I'm um where I'm pausing in that kind of teeter-totter between the two of those histories. First, it's really obvious in both sets of conversations how important it is to make distinctions between cis and trans, or between um, the normate and um, the disabled, right? In Rosemary Garland Thompson's terms, or between neurotypical and neuroatypical. This was very making distinctions for the communities was very important. Number one. Number two, those distinctions are and always will be slippery. Like there's also immediate well, that doesn't really fit, that doesn't really work. I mean, we get from the tensions between neurotypical and atypical, that's where we get neurodivergence after that, because it felt like a little bit too it was it it was specifically, related to autism and um, autism-like brains is how they put it at the time, right? Was the kind of neuroatypical, and then neurotypical was just supposed to be someone who isn't autistic or doesn't have an autistic-like brain. So it's from that kind of tension around that we start getting neurodivergence, which tries to rearrange the scene. So one, we needed both communities were trying to work through making distinctions. Number two, those distinctions were slippery and created a bunch more terms after that. But number three, these three and four are what are most interesting for me, and then I'll turn it over to C. Number three, there's a lot of jest and playfulness at the basis of the use of these words. So when cis was first getting used, there was a lot of emphasis on like this is a joke, this is an inside joke. We're sort of like hanging out, we're being cheeky together, and we call other people cis, right? Or even it's a wonderful footnote in Rosemary Garland Thompson's book. She says the word normate was actually generated not by her, and she names the person. I'm going to forget their name, but generated as a jest in a kind of disability academic conference setting, sort of like, yeah, we'll call them normate, right? So and the same with neurotypical. It's also kind of jesty, kind of a little jabby, a little there's something that playfulness, that kind of parodic, satirical, some kind of impetus was behind both categories. And I find it interesting that especially today, at least around I think around both or all of these terms I'm talking about, they've all become very serious. The playfulness has been kind of lost or overwritten, and instead these terms tend to be used as facts, as factual descriptions of existing categories. And I wonder in our politics what gets lost when we lose the playfulness. So that was point three, and then point four will just be another interesting thing to put on the table that with the generation of the term cis, for example, or neurotypical, one of the concerns among community coiners and users was that um, people wanted to be able to talk about passing and about masking. So not just that so and so is cis, but that someone might take on cisness or function as cis in the world and pass as cis in the world. And how do we talk about that? Or similarly, someone might take on or pass as or mask as neurotypical or be able to function as neurotypical, even if they're not. And how do we talk about that? So in both cases, in the early instances, there was a real interest in talking about the masking and the passing and how people are living inside of categories that may not actually reflect them. Whereas today, I think we more often use these categories as in you sit in this category, right? Not that you move in and out of these categories. So those are some interesting resonances between this moment in the early 1990s and the kind of cross community conversations around describing again what we are not was sort of the and what I find interesting last sentence here is that I think there's a deep interest in using in characterizing our others, our respective group others, in ways that don't fall into the same othering traps as those as we've suffered from. So there's also a grappling with how do we create distinctions without creating the same kinds of binaries or the same kinds of distinctions or the same kinds of exiling. And so all of that just fascinates me. I'll stop there.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Perry. So much amazing content and like food for thought. Yeah, so let's shift things over to C.
Okay, thank you. Um, I think what I want to riff on for the next few minutes is thinking through my trajectory through teaching medical ethics, bioethics, as a way of thinking in particular about how medicine's kind of constitutive opposition to disability informs and is reproduced through our ongoing medical discourses over transitions, especially in medicine. As a further example of maybe some of the ways that our discourses try to separate out trans and disability in particular, especially in an academic discipline that tends to already be pretty opposed to all of us that identify or even disidentify under those labels. Because some of my starting points, even as a graduate student, trying to grapple with bioethics as a space for exploring disability, ended up being a teaching assistant in classrooms where I was responsible for covering material on should disabled people exist? Should we trust trans people's experiences over empirical data? And doing that in a classroom that tended to draw in particular disabled and trans people who are interested in exploring those spaces and the only spaces that we seem to offer, the same reasons that I found myself there. And in those conversations, finding a flight from philosophy. A lot of students saying, like, why would I want to belong in a discipline that is actively arguing against my existence, that takes my testimonial data, the stories of my life, not as serious data with which to contend, but maybe as a limit case or a thought experiment? And so what I want to gesture at in the next few minutes is some generative thoughts around some of these confluences, are kind of on the ground discourses in medical spaces that get taken up in philosophy and especially in bioethics around transition and how they map onto the structures of ableism that we're trying to interrogate, and hopefully just use this as a bit of a riff to say, look, a lot of the critical disability work that's done in opposition or critical interrogation of these medical practices can give us a lens for also thinking about trans things a little more critically, but also how these have been forced apart, how these dialogues, perhaps across the discipline, have been separated out in part because of this primary mechanism of medicine that we seem to rely on or be forced to rely on in institutional structures. So just as a few examples of this direction, one of the big topics with regard to medical transition is this requirement of a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, as it's usually encoded in some kind of diagnostic manual and in somewhere like the DSM, that it's disabling. It's meant to be a form of disability that is impeding your life. And through that medical apparatus of disability, it's specifically a you problem, an us problem, right? That the dysphoria is something that I have rather than being something broader about our social structures, but which positions medical transition as movement away from that disabling dysphoria to something like a non-disabled person through transition who is better recognized for their gender than they were before, as part of medicine's general tendency to want to cure, erase, or otherwise minimize as much as possible a form of disability. And in response to that treatment of forms of transness as disabling, some people have said, look, I don't want to be considered disabled on account of my transness. And there are a lot of ways that this argument gets expressed, some more critical than others, right? We can look a little broadly to how this mapping onto dysphoria removes and erases a lot of trans experiences of euphoria or dysphoria, of existing and imagining different kinds of relating in community that is not necessarily couched as opposition to my body or a disability in my life. And so the calls that we have in a lot of kind of documentation say, look, I'm not sick. You should take me seriously as trans. I don't want to lie and say that I have dysphoria, that I'm disabled for the sake of medical access. And so where medicine kind of does this disavowal of disability through transition of saying like, look, we're moving away from that disability that needs to be addressed, that dysphoria, one of the lines of response is not to interrogate the ableism that constructs the need to move away from disability in that space, but to say we were never disabled. So we shouldn't be treated like disabled people are. We shouldn't be treated like mentally ill people are, or whatever labels we want to use to divide up different kinds of categorization. But leave uninterrogated then that natural tendency to treat disability as something that ought to be removed, to treat people with psychiatric conditions diagnosed of them willingly or otherwise as necessarily counting against their experience and the value of their testimony. Meanwhile, some other kind of trans scholars, Alexandra Beryl among others, have pointed out that the ways that bodily differences are counted as disabilities are sometimes contingent not on this presumed neutral theoretical, non-theoretical approach to just looking at impairments of the body or function, but are mediated by gender in the way that someone who goes through a form of medical transition, a trans man who's opposed to, and we can interrogate this further, a cis man, for the same kind of bodily needs may not be considered disabled because it's natural to that transness. So something like relying on pills to maintain gender normative hormone levels in the way that are measured of general populations. While that's normal for the trans guy in a way that the cis guy, oh, we're going to constitute that as a form of disability. And so there too, there are questions about how the construction of disability is something to be fixed versus a fixing by itself means that, this body is no longer rendered legible as disabled, even if under different definitions or critical applications of the concepts, we might say, oh, you are still disabled here as part of that transition. The things like skin grafts can be really painful, but that's just a natural side effect rather than a disabling condition, because it's part of what makes us more legible as non-disabled having moved through trans transitions. And of course, another way that disability and trans pull apart is the fact that disability can get in the way of different kinds of wanted embodiments in the world, but especially in medicine, where having a disability can be a contraindication, can count against your eligibility. for certain kinds of procedures that you might want. And no matter how much informed consent you put behind it, no matter how much knowledge you have about endocrinology, often more than endocrinologists themselves might, means that because you have a heart condition, you're not eligible until you treat, better manage whatever is going on with respect to your disability. So that disability, again, needs to be managed for trans people to have access to this movement away from a disabling dysphoria. And just a last example for sake of time. So within medical spaces, disability is used not only as an uncritical term in the philosophical sense that we might imagine, well, it's not just reducible to bodily impairments or even the limitations that people argue with respect to the social model and how that still reproduces a naturalized notion of the body. Disability also gets used as a general term in the rhetoric of medicine as what medicine is opposed to, and so is a measurement of the failures of medicine. So disability is taken as synonymous with morbidity, with poor health outcomes in general, as being ill, in a way that we construct measures of how disabled someone is or their life is, the disability burden on them. And part of the debates that then call for better empirical data on something like, well, can we reduce the disability experience by trans youth by giving them access to gender affirming care and otherwise, relies on this position of, well, disability is this bad thing that we're trying to mitigate by providing this care to individuals, because disability gets taken up both in the casual rhetoric that normalizes disability as a negative opposition to what medicine is trying to do in making people healthy, right, productive members of society more broadly. And again, cast this bit of space in the academic and the clinical and leaking into the social spaces distance between trans and disability. That to be a good trans individual who's eligible for the kind of care we want, necessarily that's a movement away from disability. Someone in the chat points to a text that I wanted to mention by name as it is. Cameron Awkward-Rich's book in general, The Terrible We, includes a good introduction to this. And thinking also just about the bad feelings of being trans and disabled right now, separate from these broader points that we're also making, the kind of reflections that we have on what it means to also feel bad about these kinds of things and the ways that our experiences map on. But so wrapping that up, in the space of educational philosophy and in bioethics in general, part of what we're doing and what we teach and how we approach these discourses is we're reproducing some of these norms. And in medical spaces that don't have a lot of interactions with philosophers, this tends to be exaggerated in an exceptionally uncritical way, where trans care is taken as a separate issue from disability care and vice versa, and the opposition is stretched out. I've been invited by former students to go to their masters in, say, public health policy and present at their symposium on attending to things like oppression and marginalization of social determinants of health. And first they go, maybe, oh, a philosopher, what do they have to do here? We're focused on like really caring about broader populations in clinical and statistical, biostatistical analyses. What could they have to say? But the second line to that is typically just, why would we talk about disability? We have this list of groups of people that are marginalized by gender, by sex, by race, by ethnicity, by religion. And as comprehensive as a list they might develop, disability is not on there because health is usually taken as opposed to that disability. Public health initiatives will say, you know, people not moving around enough in a city, we need to facilitate their action because, well, sitting still is the leading cause of disability and death. There's an opposition to the kinds of changes that we might want to make in the world. And therefore, opening up trans futures as necessarily one that precludes disability against those of us who are both trans and disabled, but also against more rich interrogations of what trans and disabled can mean and what we want to do with them. So, as a further spur, thinking in particular about how medicine seeps into our philosophy and vice versa, which is also tied up with our previous points about who counts as normal, what it means to other individuals in a way that we separate them out, and especially in legal discourse that relies on medical expertise over the kinds of lived experiences of individuals and what that might reify. That's it from me.
Awesome. Thank you, C. Thank you so much. Yeah, so we're gonna take a few minutes for us to riff with each other for a minute, if that's cool. But I want to just lift up some really important things I'm seeing in the chat here. Um, I also taught the Terrible We last year, and that, and I mentioned it to these folks on the panel before we started, that it's been a book that's really been important for me. And I mean, I would think one thing to mark too that I wanted to kind of draw out here in our conversation, because I know in the broader program, there's a lot of folks who are working on a number of these kind of like contested areas in relation to disability and philosophy, or maybe disability discourses more broadly. Because another area which I've been thinking has been around addiction discourses. And I think another kind of like space where we see this attempt, just to riff on what you just said, see this effort to try to get people into a more normalized, I would say, labor pool, so that their labor can be extracted um, by by racialized capitalism. Although I think another frame here is that like the how addiction and recovery narratives are part of this as well, and also cleaves between who is like the good addict who's seeking treatment and who's the kind of irredeemable bad addict who is now no longer doing the right kind of self-motivated behaviors and so on. And also, so that's one kind of additional discourse that I think is important to kind of have in the conversation here, which I think both Cameron Awkward-Rich and Hill Molatino have been really, I think, in two recent books on trans affect and the relationships between, being trans and feeling bad, have both really, I think Hill probably more so than Awkward-Rich directly, but Hill Molatino's book is also having us think about addiction and addiction-related discourses and the relationship between trans and disability as well, which I really loved. Um, and then also to add fatness and anti-fat discourses, because I think again, this is another one of those places like you were describing with the kind of medicalized language around who's deserving or undeserving, or who gets the kind of responsibilization discourses that are then so punitive and so violent in a lot of ways towards fat folks, because I think that's something that has been I think it also exists in this kind of tense relationship to disability, and certainly has an impact on who gets access to care as trans as well. So for sure. So I think these are really important points. I have a question. I have a couple questions that I want to just pose to my colleagues because on the panel, because I think these were things that I was thinking when you all were discussing your points, and we can also open up for questions from the panelists as well, and then we'll open up to the broader conversation in just a moment. Harry, I've obviously read, well, he knows I've read his book, maybe not obviously to everyone, but I've read an early draft of his book last year, or last semester. Yeah, I don't think it was written last year. Last semester. Really love the work, excited about it. I wanted to kind of pitch back to you the idea about the 90s as a decade, because I think obviously for Susan Stryker and others, like the 90s is such a pivotal decade in terms of trans studies more broadly. And I know you say this in the book a little bit. But I also wanted to ask us that about, like, if we're thinking about, the passage of the ADA in the US, we're thinking about UK disability rights discourses, like why the 90s? What makes the 90s such a crucial site, a crucial decade? And obviously we could talk about the turn into the next century, but I'm really interested in that. I mean, for me, there's so much happening in that decade, not just because I was in it, but because I'm also thinking of things like, the fall of the Soviet Union, which Stryker picks up on. But then the special period in Cuba is hugely important. In Latin America, we're seeing tons of infrastructural readjustment and things like that going on through like Washington Consensus and neoliberalization. And I know that your work has also touched on the development of the discourse of cisgender and cis, and now, cis-related terms in Argentina and Brazil. So, the 90s are, I think a really important decade also for people who study Latin America and study neoliberalism. So I guess I just wanted to pitch back to you, like, what does the 90s mean? Like, and maybe more another additional layer to that question, 90s and humor. Like, why, like, what is it about play in the 90s or play in that moment that was happening? Not that there's nothing funny today, but that there's like, what is it about 90s humor that might have been relevant, or a 90s cultural moments in the 90s, because I do really appreciate your point that cisgender and non-disabled have become very bureaucratic terms. And I'm not claiming non-disabled or cis to any. I'm not attempting to defend them to any degree, but I think they become very bureaucratic. And I liked you've tracked some of this in the book through like checklists and ways that they became institutionalized and stuff like that. But what does 90s tell us? Like what was happening in terms of affect in the 90s that might also be worth touching on. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you for that. I love the invitation to think about this. It's gonna take me a while to think about it, but I'll give it a first response. One of the big things about the 90s that matters for the use of the terms I specifically highlighted is the availability of the internet. So, of course, some people were using it in the 80s, but the 90s becomes a time when it's more accessible, and people are starting to organize themselves and organize with each other and find each other, especially when there's one of you in a town or one of you in a state, and there's sort of these international forums that are being formed, that allows a more community-based dialogue to happen, and that's where we start getting kind of the riffing through these terms, both in especially autistic organizing and trans organizing at the time. So the internet is a big deal. As far as what's happening in the 90s, I don't know why humor. I'm not really sure. I love that question, but I would like to add just very briefly. What's also happening in the 90s, really relevant to trans and disabled and queer communities, is AIDS, and specifically AIDS before it's any form of successful treatment, and especially early 90s is when you start seeing um, so much death it becomes unbearable, and there's a real diaspora sort of feeling where you've lived in a place so long and seen so many people die, you leave. So there's a lot of that happening in the early 90s. So there's incredible grief, incredible frustration, abandonment of um, disabled and queer communities at that time, obviously. And I would flag that something that um, uh, Cameron Awkward Rich's chapter that you all highlighted here specifically. One of the things that's left out in that chapter that is important is that the debate about including or not including trans in the ADA was lifted up in the context of a worry about protecting people with AIDS, and it was about disgust around AIDS, and it's under that homosexuality and transness comes in. So it's really important to bring AIDS into that specific conversation about the ADA and its separation of disability and transness.
Absolutely. Like, and I think the language in that, not to be too, um, you know, pointed on it, was about transvestites and about HIV/AIDS and about drug users specifically. And then also like there was reference to like alcoholics and like the language in that those hearings, those Senate hearings is really stark. So yeah, absolutely super important. Um yeah, do Perry or C questions for each other or among us?
I do want to ping back to the fatness point briefly and talk about bodily desire in general, right? Because I had in my list that, of course, in enumerating those things from medicine, there's a bit of a problem in the ways that ableism is deployed differently within the discourses of transition. Is this, that assumes a relatively linear transition between some binary genders, typically, which doesn't really capture a lot. And part of what it doesn't capture is just talking about trans and disability in isolation of things like race, fatness, and other ways that identities or labels are applied to people, especially in the Western oculocentrism that people like Oyuronke Oyumi has criticized, our focus on visual appearances. That fat bodily comportment can change the apparent labeling of things like legibility of gender and disability. The fatness is medicalized. I think we're going to come back to medicalization. I can see a question in the Q&A, but fatness that gets medicalized as a form of disability, either in the sense of just body shape or body mass, but also in the endocrinological interpretations of obesity as having to do with underlying pathology of hormones or something. Both figures fatness as possibly disabling, but also something that separates people from these gender ideals or norms, such that changing that disability of fatness is meant to help regulate people's appropriate presentation in the context of particular gender norms, whether or not that's mediated by what we conventionally consider trans to be. So in the way that Perry was pointing to, are questions about what kind of genders are cis beyond the trans scope and what mediates those kinds of things. Fatness is something that is absolutely medicalized as a disability within medical spaces, whether we necessarily want to frame it as such for the majority of people. And I would also hint here, just in terms of the other possible sites of desire for bodily changes, many of them are not going to track in medical spaces as legible if they're not recapitulating or recouping somebody as a proper gender. So in the way that both of y'all just riffing on the ADA, for example, and the exclusion of trans there, marks it out like as a candidate disability, but one that we are not supporting, right? So it's a disability, but not the right kind to be recuperated. And how that fits into these practices of legibility, I think Alexander Beryl and some others have pointed to, well, what about transability? What about this desire to become disabled that is so normatively assumed to be pathological that why would someone desire a disability? So not merely the question of whether disability can be constructed neutrally outside of these systems of power or that it's a negative thing that needs to be fixed. What if it's desire and what if we desire it? And if trans transitions, if the ways that we fix and play with our bodies, depending on the kind of language you use to describe yourself, is kind of creative construction of something that might seem legible as disability in other contexts for people who are not seen as trans, that might open up pathways in the other direction for creatively thinking about what disability can be and what it means to desire disability in the same way that we might desire our transness or our fatness. And so I'm interested both in those effective things that were pointed to, like Il Malatino. I would also say Smilges came up quite a bit in the earlier sessions as well, J. Logan Smilges and others, thinking about both those kind of desires as well as the bad affective feelings circulating. And so I'm interested in thinking about how the legibility of who is not us, right, can also fit into, well, some of these feeling bad and also feeling in community or having particular kinds of desires to dig out spaces. Uh, Pushing that back, maybe to Perry.
Yeah, thank you. I also wanted to return, Andrea, to some of your comments and just to also share that there's a book Os Keys has recently finished and is going to press, so it'll be a little bit while before we all see it. But one of the things that um they've found is that all of the according to all their research, which is like they interviewed um all of the still living people who worked at the early gender clinics in the U.S. And one of the things that Keyes argues and demonstrates is that all the people running these gender clinics and developing trans medical care specifically were explicitly eugenicists and assumed that yeah, of course some people should be sterilized and certainly these people should be sterilized. So I just wanted to flag that as like a very long-standing, kind of correlation and commitment, within at least trans medicine, and I think it's something that we haven't, as a community really grappled with. What does it mean to reclaim a technique or a technology that was generated under those conditions and with those commitments, right? Doesn't mean we can't, but it does mean that like what I think we need to think there and stay there for a minute. And I appreciate Andrea that you're kind of pointing us to this use of uh an immediate rejection of sterilization now as a like that's why we can't allow for trans medicine, but the sterilization as a concern in relation to trans has been long standing, and it's changed in its faces, and we I think it's I'm eager for us to talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a really those are both C and Perry really helpful points to raise here. Um I mean, I just want to flag like Nisha Cardenas, who's worked on also like trans reproductive life and like what that means in the context of trans of color life. And then uh yeah, I was thinking, see, with your comments about David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder's Able Nationalism. They have a really something that has been pivotal for my thinking as well on politics and the biopolitics of disability. They also kind of do this Foucauldian analysis of disability, but they're looking particularly at like who's redeemable within a kind of like the nation state's own framing of its medical apparatus and its own like uh, you know its broader economic goals and things like that. And so they're thinking about like this language of like those who are the non-deserving disabled, quote unquote, become this kind of peripheral embodiments. And that's where I also think Awkward Rich is thinking of the terrible we, right? Like the terrible we are those of us who are in those peripheral embodiments who don't get the kind of uplift narratives or overcoming narratives or the kind of like the kind of violent inclusion that can be part of the institutional framings of both trans and disabled life. And I think that's like I like the way that like that nebulous category, the terrible we, becomes like creating like solidarity in the midst of the difficulty of that, right? Like it's not a romanticized we in the sense of like reclaimed for the state or reclaimed for even a generative purpose, like it's reclaimed in the sense of like sitting with one another in the difficulty of it, I think, rather than like something more seemingly productive or an output. Um, I think we've got a lot of really interesting comments already happening here in the chat. I know we did have a question, and I appreciate. I've got now a couple questions here, including from Naomi Sheeman, who I want to just uh, give some space here as well, who's an extraordinary colleague and friend in this space. So let's see. Naomi's first question came early on that said, "Can someone speak to the complexities around pathologization, wanting to push back against it on the one hand and wanting access to medical treatment and insurance coverage? How do these complexities play out similarly/differently in trans and disability contexts?" And then we have another question here from Naomi that says, "What about people identifying as cis or neurotypical or non-disabled specifically and explicitly as an acknowledgement of being regarded and treated as privileged? This can be seen as a form of allyship, like acknowledging or problematizing whiteness. Alternatively, one can avoid those labels to undermine the presumption of natural normality as a form of solidarity. How do either of these as political moves resonate with Perry's pointing out the playfulness of cis and normie as political in the cheeky playfulness?" And so I want to offer those from Naomi, and then also invite everyone in the session, if they want to participate through the Q&A, please feel free to do that. We're going to kind of open it more broadly now and give some space for a broader conversation. So maybe I'll open the floor to Perry and C if you all want to open up to any of those questions.
C, do you want to jump in?
That a request to? I know it's directed a little more so at you, but earlier in some of the previous sessions, there was also this talk about what even neurodivergence as a term that applies to individuals and neurodiversity to groups, mapping on the idea that it feels weird to say that an individual is maybe diverse by themselves. But I know some of the pushback to also that is, well, divergence implies that we are moving away from something, diverging from something that kind of normate. And so some of the questions in general may be about self-labeling. So Andrea mentioned, for example, some work thinking about how when we excavate different meanings of disability as setting people up as viable, possible biocitizens. Jasbir Poir has also done some work in this direction. And one of the questions that it raises around kind of identity labels in general is what we want them to do for us. And one thing that I heard, Andrea pointing about a terrible we is a unifying rallying point and one of the sites of coalition that we can build up. While some people have argued for like maybe what we need to do is just expand our categories of identities as far as possible so that it makes it harder to regulate in a way that we're participating in the construction of data that allows us to be seen or controlled or renormalized according to different metrics. So again, just going to health for a moment, because that's where a lot of my specialization is. Well, if I make legible different identity categories like a diagnostic label, then suddenly I have a population that looks legible under that label that I can then study and renormalize with respect to these new labels and definitions. That leads to different forms of identity construction that they might want to resist. The other alternative, some trans and queer people have suggested, is just to disidentify like just reject any form of labeling in a way that suggests this kind of distancing. Part of the problem, of course, is how we talk maybe about our experiences in those ways, but there might be something nice about not trying to defend what non-binary means with reference necessarily to that which I am non, and what it means to be non-binary, and to maybe reinforce binary in those spaces. So that's not going as directly to Naomi's question so much as also riffing on some of the discourse that I've seen throughout the previous several hours and previous sessions as well. But what it means to take on these labels, both as a form of allyship that might seem to normalize things, but also as a way of positioning ourselves within relevant structures of power. But then the question is also directed a little more to you with playfulness and curiosity as well. And I'm really interested in hearing how our jokey uses of these terms towards others and towards ourselves, I admit, also fit into or against these kinds of normalizing structures, maybe.
Yeah, I think the playfulness and the jokey use of terms, at least resituates our it resituates what we're saying from a label to a word. I think it pulls our words back into their word category instead of into their labeling category. And it allows the playfulness allows the word to bend and to be used in different ways rather than the seriousness of the label. So I do like the playfulness for that reason, and does getting rid of does a certain resistance to labels. It doesn't mean we don't have to use words for descriptions of ourselves, but those descriptions become lighter. They can become more playful. Um, I did want to also say you raised the question about neurodivergence and neurodiverse, and can a person be neurodiverse? I've always One of the things I've thought for a while is that um, I do want to leave room for multiple minds in one person, and so in that sense, for me it makes good sense to allow someone to use the word neurodiverse of themselves if they find themselves to be of more than one mind, for example. So that sometimes the rejection of neurodiverse for a given person reinstantiates that one person has one mind, and that mind has a unity of itself, which is itself a normative expectation. So yeah, I aim for some flexibility around the word neurodiverse. Um, and whether it can apply to a group or an individual. But then back to Naomi Shimon's question, I would say that in the use of especially cisgender, I think it's important to use these words recognizing some of their limitations. So especially cisgender right now, it just means that your gender matches your sex. For example, that's like one of the easiest ways in which people circulate the term. But I want us to, like, stay with the really disorienting question of what is a gender that matches a sex? Like, what is a gender anyway? And what is a sex? And how would we even conceive of these 2 things as matching or not matching? I mean, to me, it's just we're already talking about apples and oranges. So how do apples and oranges match to begin with? Doesn't make sense. So I just think there's so much instability about what a gender is and what sex is, right? Beans Boloci's new book, Sex Isn't Real. Read this, and see all the many different ways in which people have actually tried to figure out what sex is, and kind of placed the anchor in different words and terms and biological facts and things like that. So cisgender, I think it makes more sense to say I move through the world being uh, normalized as cis. Right? That makes a little more sense than I am cisgender. It would make more sense to say I move through the world being normalized as cis. So people treat me as if whatever match is supposed to be there is there, you know? But using it as an identity category somehow renaturalize does risk renaturalizing that there is a gender and there is a sex and there is a way they match for me.
Awesome. We have a lot of great comments and stuff coming through, so I'm not gonna be able to keep up with the chat, but I do want to pivot to the Q&A. Find it again here quick. Um, so we got a couple of questions that came in as well. So from August, I've been thinking a lot about surgery as having a aesthetic dimension to it lately. It's all over the websites of cosmetic surgeons who often display their other artistic pursuits alongside their surgical outcomes. Do any of you have thoughts about how ableism, fat phobia, racism, and transphobia combine with this aesthetic aspect of medicine, and how that constrains what surgeons see as a possible good surgical outcome? To give a really concrete example, BMI limits on top surgeries due to dog ears being unpalatable surgical outcomes. And then let's just do you all wanna take 2 questions, or should we, just yeah, okay, I'll bring in a second question. Second question from, Hypatia, uh, of Siva, I'm not sure how to say that. Um, when we talk about this topic more generally, what do you think about the dialectics of identity as such? That I can't truly know myself without fixing myself into something be even I won't be even just thinking that? And how do you understand the particularity of being reflected in the logical finiteness of strictly logically equal identities of subjectivity? So, 2 questions for our group. I'll just jump in quickly with the first question. Yeah, this is exactly where I was thinking about uh connections between fat phobia and trans life, because this is, there are surgeons here in Western New York who won't perform surgeries based on BMI. So it's also even I think that's very much about what these surgeons are using as a kind of aesthetic criteria, which have, you know with no knowledge of a patient's health um, record or medical record, make blanket claims about whether, like, BMI itself determines who they'll consider as a candidate for surgery. And I know that because I have a list from a recent provider I was able to access, gender affirming care here in New York, and that's, like, in their statements about who they'll serve as patients. So, I also think we have, I think this is harkening back to the history of sexology. We also have very much a very whitened aesthetic for as an aspect of medicine, if we want to put it that way, that I think is the long arc of eugenics and medicine that tells us something both about whitening as in, kind of like phenotypical embodied features. So like who is considered a candidate for medical affirming care or medical transition, or whatever they were calling it at the time. We're, as many people know, we had to be white, had to be straight, had to be within a number of confines, like in terms of appearance or gender appearance. But I also think, like, we have whiteness also as a kind of like aspirational psychological category that's also probably within a lot of this. So like if we think about what makes a good patient, is this is C, maybe giving a nod to you in the bioethics realm, or critiques of medicine and medical institutions realm. But like, we know that how whether a patient is seen at all depends on whether they're following certain racialized um ableist norms in terms of being able to receive access to care. So I do think, yeah, there's a lot in your question, August, about how we can think about these aesthetic aspects of medicine. So I do appreciate the comment. So yeah, let me open up to my fellow panelists.
Riff. So these are, I mean, I love all the questions we're getting, and they're great in part because they're not easy, right? So in thinking both around aesthetics, and also I had missed as part of Naomi's question earlier, the challenge between pathologization and also thinking about wanting access to medical treatment as well. And we're talking about sexology and the dominance of a white model in terms of what counts as normative, while also acknowledging that the development of these fields are premised on the forced experimentation on Black and Indigenous people typically. And so even though the norms that we're constructing, they're constructed through these abuses of power, I've seen other people reference intelligence and sanity with respect to madness and disability in the chat, and how colonization as a practice and process is often premised on the idea of others as necessarily less than human, and in particular where humanity is associated with forms of normative reasoning that is reflected in that whiteness. That a lot of like our psychiatric classifications and disorders that we apply to people are disproportionately diagnosed based on these other identity markers. So Jonathan Metzl and others have pointed to like the history of schizophrenia as a predominantly Black disease, in the sense that it's used as a form of diagnosis to control populations also, so that if somebody has a form of thought that seems non-normative, like the fact that maybe people should have access to relevant civil rights, that's clearly a thought that's outside the normative template of what whiteness in society functions as, with the whiteness disappearing into the background, that allows for that diagnosis of disability premised on just racial ideals of equality and equity. And so then going back into the question of surgery and what that normalizes, being premised both on whiteness and on this submerged history of the deracialization of racialized folks and constructing what we take to be normal, the kind of surgeries that we take as productive and ideal. I think there's an interesting question about the aesthetics of what's being folded under here, not just in a possible metaphor about how our bodies fold in disabled or fat ways and how those are seen as fitting certain kinds of templates, but also in when we do talk about, meeting these norms of whiteness, how the construction of those norms is premised on this violent opposition to anything that is constructed as non-white, and which is not only about the flesh that appears visibly, but also the norms of rationality that people are appropriately picking out in the chat as well. So those are some initial points about the aesthetics and the ideals of aesthetics of what appears as premise also upon what has disappeared. And part of the excavating of disabled and trans and racialized histories is looking at the entanglements of those things in particular. We have further thoughts, Perry?
No, I appreciate the way both of you kind of tackled those questions.
Cool. Let me just shift back to I'm trying to think about this dialectics of identity question. Um, uh, because I'm like thinking about, the kind of critique of logics of equivalence. And I think that was maybe the last part of this logical finiteness of equal identities of subjectivity. I think that's like really, in a really, like direct way, like what's so difficult about a panel like this that asks us, like, for those of us who think from like multiplicity and have to by virtue of like navigating multiple languages, multiple cultures, multiple classes, class, social classes, worlds, so to say, to invoke Maria Lugones, that like, I think that's like this is like one of the most key questions, because what it does is like asks, and this is maybe also what the recently late Elizabeth Spellman described as this kind of pop bead model of metaphysics, this idea that like everyone has a race and a gender and a class and some relationship to disability and ability, and that they're on a pop beads on a string, and that she was very critical of that idea, obviously. But I think that is a really I think what that is like pushing against, like, what that is like a model for thinking about. And Perry, you said something a while back that really struck me about the difference between words and labels, which I thought was really cool, because I do think like I love the way that you, in at least in your work, have been like you think with words, you say cute things like but words are his favorite and things like that when you're describing yourself, which is which is a way of kind of the tenderness and like material and affective resonances of words, which puts them in an aesthetic register, I think, more than a kind of like disciplining like container model. And I think, if that's true on what you think about words, I don't know. I'm sure you think many things about words. But so I think this like idea of identities as logically equivalent is also kind of using a container model, right? Like using this idea of like somehow something could fill in what gender is or what race is. And I think for me, what's really transformative about the work of Awkward Rich or Cirelli Thornton or Misha Cardenas or people who are, or Jasbir Puar, I think all people who have been named today, is that like part of what I see in their work is less a kind of like need to understand like a container model, like less of a need to like to force us back to have to grapple with words or terms as containers, and more about the kind of like exactly how fluid any device, any technique can be, words among them, but that can be used as both a weapon and as a tool for those of us who are seeking to resist, and a strategy to resist. And I do think that, just thinking back to, these questions about who gets deemed eligible or ineligible for access to care and resources, I think a lot of what I think we end up, um, I think learning is that like the devices, the tools, the words, the material technologies of clothing, of you know things that we can adorn and hold ourselves, prosthetics, anything that's part of our embodied practices, has these multiple possibilities. And I know I'm speaking in general terms right now because, I'm thinking very generally about it, but I think that helps me free up of like why I need to like decide what I think, again, Perry, back to your work, like why we need to define what this term means. But I think one thing that you did do in your book and that I hear you saying today is like having names for like how these things systemically mark and divide. And I think back to Naomi's question about who makes one eligible or ineligible for insurance coverage, or for even being a candidate for a particular medical procedure, or gets access to medication, HIV/AIDS medication, which I know is also, again, back to your point about how AIDS has been such a pivotal moment in thinking about trans life. We're returning again now to the denial of HIV/AIDS medication coverage under this current regime in the United States. And so I do think, that's something that we can look at that, fracturing apparatus, that kind of attempt to use the term or diagnosis, or to use an embodied status as a way of fracturing and pulling and creating, a sense of meritocracy and desert. But that's not how we have to organize. I think that's, again, like why I think how we can organize, how we can think doesn't have to rely on the state's own, kind of ability to pull us apart, or to seek to split us. And I think, as I said from the outset, I'm thinking a lot about what immigration, the violence of immigration and customs enforcement right now, and I'm thinking specifically like the disabling and the maiming that's happening through immigration enforcement and abroad, right? Like, I mean, what's happening outside of the U.S., because I think part of what we're seeing when we see these devastating images of prisons in El Salvador is also like the generational forms of violence that the state is now doing. In that case, the Salvadoran and U.S. state in collusion with one another, but what they will be doing for many generations to people who are being violated by those regimes. So I think, like, that broader picture of like where disabling, like where violence happens through the projects of maiming and debility and trauma, I think are like a big piece of my mind. So I don't want to think about who counts or doesn't count within that as deserving of life. Like, I think that becomes a question that I find, uh, you know, from my thinking, unhelpful. So, Yeah, I don't know if folks want to riff on that, but I want to bring in another question here from Samantha Leone, who says, "Hi, do you consider the word disabled as a key tool to reinforce power dynamics between heteronormative people and people from the trans community?" And I think that was one that we've kind of been circling around as well.
I mean, I think certainly words like sick or crazy or insane, or I mean, there are many more, but these sorts of words have absolutely been a way to push, and not just trans, but I want to kind of open that category up a bit. If we're going to talk decades and even centuries ago, right? To just think about um, the ways people whose genders are uncomfortable to different regimes and different fracturing systems. Um, I think the conjointure, the thinking these things together, disability and illness, and of course moral depravity, which was also attributed uh, to our communities, right, is one of the ways to make a distinction or a boundary here. But trans, yeah, I do struggle with trans versus the notion of trans versus the heteronormative people, because of course what we're missing right in there would be all sorts of forms of queerness are left out of the heteronormative versus trans, right? There's a lot in between and beyond those categories, and how attributions of disability or sickness or illness, or insanity or madness as categories have been used to make various differences and distinctions and exilings. All of these things have histories to them, and I want to attend to those histories. Um, yeah, and also to notice, going back, Andrea, to some of the things you were talking about with the a lot notion of identities and these additive beads, right? Um, yeah, I just want to reemphasize that the genealogical emphasis, thanks also to Shelley, right, is so necessary when we're talking about these. Like the question is where and when these distinctions have been made. Where and when categories like race become salient, become presumed as something each of us has, or genders as something each of us has, or sexualities as something each of us has, right? And there's human many different human formations of understanding selves, and non-selves have existed, and we have to kind of grapple with the wisdoms and limitations of a lot of those things. But we have to call out what's happening right now, and the kind of systems under which we exist right now. But I think, Andrea, I really appreciate your push here to say that it doesn't mean that's where we organize always, right? Sure, we have to meet with the power where it's hitting us, but that doesn't need to be the only place that we're working.
I want to This cuts away from our current conversation for a moment, just acknowledging some different things in the chat because I'm not as equipped with the Adorno or the Hegel that's popped up for some of the questions in the background of thinking through identity. But I do like a point in particular that Hypatia brought up earlier, about how a lot of this is painfully obvious. And I think both those words have some meaningful context in Shelley's offer to us to construct this panel around how philosophy of disability and trans philosophy might fit together. Because, I don't know everybody in the audience, and we're probably a heterogeneous group. But one thing that I found difficult in trying to carve out space where I am for talking about trans and disability is that the primary issues that I raised as problems for how we were doing philosophy were taken as, yeah, that's obvious and we agree, right? And there is work to the effect by Sarah Ahmed and On Being Included. I had to recall it by looking at it, thinking about how people become problems, but also how the problems are kind of cast away through actually acknowledging them through these forms of speech acts by acknowledging them and not making them real. And that what might be painfully obvious to us somehow doesn't seem to make it into the philosophical canon nonetheless. For its obviousness that even people who tend not to think critically about disability, transgender, or sexuality, etc., seem to say, yeah, we ought to make philosophy more accessible. And we might suspect that the obvious of that would then result in action accordingly, or the taking up of these theories. And so one thing, whether or not we want to address it explicitly, that I'm interested in the coalitional possibilities between trans philosophy and philosophy of disability, as streams in philosophy that have come from our experiences, from theorizing from the ground and the kind of what it's like and what we're puzzling through. Talia May Betcher says, the kind of what the fuck of being trans or also being disabled, rather than merely philosophizing over what these identities could be. I think one of the interesting sites of possible resistance are people just kind of acknowledging, yeah, that's obvious, in a way that is perhaps painful for us because that obviousness doesn't track into meaningful uptake. And so I wonder at some point how people acknowledging these things is a meaningful form of dismissal almost, and trying to take up this work. So that's riffing off an acknowledgement that maybe for some of us, these discourses are feeling a little lighter than had we prepared more direct presentations in advance. But I also take it as maybe generative for thinking about where we want the direction of trans philosophy of disability to go. I don't know if anyone wants to riff on that further. I see Andrea is unmuted.
Oh yeah, I didn't know where you were going, but I'm open to that. Yeah. um, where we want trans philosophy of disability to go. Um, I do have some thoughts on that, but let me take a quick note on that because I'm working on something that I think would be relevant. Yeah, and just to be full disclosure, like none, I, at least speaking for myself, I did not have a full presentation to bring here. This was not what we were asked. We were asked to riff on questions, which I'm happy to do. Also to apologize to Hypatia in the chat that it's been a long time since I've read Adorno or Hegel, so I cannot satisfy any question or curiosity that might come up right now about that. So I hope that that other folks are able to kind of support you in those questions. I will say, I've been working on a piece that I was Shelley has invited me to do on, I think it's called Philosophy of Disability, Latinx Philosophy and of Disability. It's got an and of in there, which I have been playing with a little bit. And it's quite hard to do because what I'm realizing is that, as I mentioned, I work on Latinx philosophy and I have for a very long time. But when I started digging in to write this article, it's not that there aren't Latinx writers and Latin American and Caribbean diasporic writers and artists and organizers who have framed health and embodiment and all of the kind of peripheral forms of exclusion and inclusion that we're talking about that are relevant to disability studies more generally. It's that philosophy is actually kind of like the outlier in an interesting way, and maybe that's not true. Like maybe it's but like, when I'm going back to read the authors who have shaped my thinking in Latinx philosophy, including, Linda Alcoff, who was my external chair of my department, my dissertation, including the very, again, recently late Eduardo Mendieta, also Ofelia Schuta, Jorge Gracia, who worked here at the institution at University of Buffalo for many years before I started working here. So when I go back and read their work, despite also many of those folks living with or caring for or being part of intense networks that involved likely people who either had formal diagnoses of some sort or disability labels or not, disability as a philosophical concept is not something that's circulated very concretely in their work. And so just one example, and this is not meant to be a kind of a direct critique. I'm not trying to do a hot take on my mentors and and folks that I love here. What it's meant to say is that I think what might be painfully obvious, again, to invoke that phrase, is that like for some folks who are like some folks don't find and have not found, especially, there's a lot of folks of color who are not finding, and I think Sammy Chalk, among others, makes this point very carefully, that like disability hasn't been a rallying cry for a lot of communities in struggle because of its whiteness. So like, and I don't want to say that means that everyone who was talking about health and embodiment in Latinx philosophy was doing so from a like a very like really thoughtful disability, affirming perspective. Yeah, Leah Lakshmi Samrasana, absolutely. But because what I'm finding, there are also some problematic things that are worth exploring. But it's to say that, like, I think, there's a lot of ways in which claiming the like a word and the movement of a word like disability has come with some kind of political risks, and it comes with not, not ones that many of us now, like, I think, there's a really Aurora Lemons Morales makes a really beautiful invocation to Gloria Anzaldúa, who had passed by the time Lemons Morales writes this note to her, who says, if there had been a disability justice discourse as robust and Black and Brown and Indigenous and as full and complex during your lifetime, we think you would have joined it. Like, we think you would have responded to that call. And I think, like, that's kind of the way I think about some of the works that I'm now wrestling with between Latinx philosophy and philosophy of disability. It's like, I feel like a lot of these authors are like, they were given a very white framed version of what disability meant and is. And I think that's by virtue also of, like, the 90s. I think if we're going to go back to that decade and thinking about what was happening in the 90s, because I think even of among the people that we were thinking with, to no detriment of their own. I mean, Rosemary Garland Thompson, I think, was doing extraordinary work in the 90s, also thinking about race and so on. But, like, it was not one that was centered in a discourse that was thinking about race and disability together. And I think, like, that's something that, I'm just, one of the things, if I'm going to think about hopefulness for the future, is, like, again, like, how those dialogues are becoming more, uh let me find the right word. I don't complex is one way to put it, but I think also, like, historically nuanced, so that, like, for example, the way that I'm particularly interested in, like, the health politics of the United Farm Workers, and, like, the ways that they were trying to think about and they do so in ways that aren't necessarily always conducive to, like, affirming crip futures, for example, like, as the way it would be put today, because there's kind of this, like, language of, like, well, we need to stop the use of toxic pesticides because it leads to more disability and leads to more disabled futures. Um, and they're thinking about, like, what are the kinds of, like, ways in which people are able to live together and they're struggling together, so that those are like, these things are literally poisoning communities and generations of communities. And so there's, like, those really complicated conversations that are, historically nuanced about the kinds of violence and the kinds of possibilities for social cohesion that were happening among, for example, organized migrant workers in the latter half of the 20th century. And so I think, like, there's, I want us to be, what's the word? Like, that I'm just gonna just riff on Perry always, which is, like, have the kind of open hand, and to be able to kind of be nimble and flexible and with our thinking and with our historical uh, uh, you know genealogies of how to think through disability in Latinx studies, or disability and philosophy of disability in Latinx studies. So I'll stop there.
So if I can just interject here, I'm thinking about Perry's need to catch a train, and I'm wondering how the time is doing for him.
Yeah, that would be great.
So maybe we can just wrap up here. It's been an amazing session as far as I'm concerned. It's been so illuminating, and it seems like so many windows have opened, and I'm just so I feel so privileged to have been able to sit here and listen to the three of you. Thank you so much. And to the people who contributed to a wonderful chat all day long, thank you so much. I hope that everyone's going going to try to get back at other points during the conference tomorrow and Friday. So we'll just wrap up there, and thank you all. Thank you, Jamie, for your diligence and your conscientious work for us always. And have a good evening or morning or wherever you are, whatever it is. Okay, bye.